Welcome everyone to Design Bytes, a weekly series that takes a look at and breaks down good, bad, and interesting instances of game design. For today's video, we're going to take a trip to the Sinnoh region and examine how Nintendo and Game Freak took a major chance by significantly changing the battle formula in the Pokemon series. It's time to examine how Pokemon Diamond and Pearl introduced the physical and special split, and how its introduction has since defined battle mechanics in the series. The Pokemon franchise has always had a bunch of unique quirks in its battle mechanics, but the nice thing about this series is that the developers have always been willing to change something when change was needed. One of the more interesting decisions found in the first 3 generations is how the game handled the relationship between move typings and Pokemon stats. Moves in Pokemon games are split into 2 categories. Those that do physical damage that run off a Pokemon's physical attack and physical defense stats, along with those that do special damage that run off a Pokemon's special attack and special defense stat. This system is easy to understand, and it creates a lot of strategic depth, but the first 3 generations battle mechanics tied the damage category to a move's typing, meaning that all moves from a single type were either purely physical or special. For example, Ice-type moves were always special regardless of the user, whereas Ground-type moves were always physical. On the surface, this style of doing battle mechanics isn't inherently bad. Players only need to remember which types of moves are special and which types are physical, which is easy enough, but the problem from this system and the reason why it needed to change was because Pokemon themselves were not adequately designed around this style of gameplay. Because the damage category was tied to the move's typing, it meant that some Pokemon were less than great because their stats and type were constantly at odds with each other. On the flip side, there are some Pokemon who are exceptionally good because their typing matched well with their given stats. There are a ton of good examples of this in action, but let's point out a couple from each category. Flareon and Sneasel are poster children for Pokemon who were negatively affected in the first 3 generations, while other Pokemon like Gengar and Alakazam benefited heavily from this system. In the case of Flareon and Sneasel, both Pokemon's main offensive stat is physical attack, but the fire typing and ice/dark typing respectively meant that all of their moves were running off their special attack stat, which was intentionally low. Their available move pool also didn't have a lot of other moves that worked off their attack stat, which meant that despite any other good qualities, the Pokemon in this situation were always more unreliable compared to others. On the flip side, Gengar and Alakazam were almost always guaranteed to be good, because they have a strong and diverse move pool that runs off their high special attack stats. Alakazam was able to run powerful psychic attacks, while Gengar was a particularly interesting case back in the day. Because the Ghost and Poison typings were physical, his move pool often revolved around running various moves of different types, such as Thunderbolt, Ice Punch, and Psychic that all ran off his special attack stat. Pokemon who had access to moves that ran off their proper stat, despite their own typing, were always at an inherent benefit. Of course, these Pokemon have other reasons why they're good, but being able to pick and choose moves to run off their best stats always gave them an advantage in pretty much every circumstance. By the time Generation 4 rolled around in 2007, it was clear that this system needed a change as the series matured. Starting in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, Nintendo and Game Freak reworked the mechanics so that every single non-status move in the game belonged to either the physical or special category regardless of their type. This is commonly referred to by fans as the physical and special split. It's hard to appreciate how many massive ramifications on Pokemon's battling philosophy this decision had. And now that several years have passed, it's safe to say that these changes were a necessity and have created a much better experience. But why? The main reason why this change worked was because it instantly created balance and viability for a whole new set of Pokemon that didn't have it before. Although there will always be some Pokemon who are naturally stronger or weaker than others, it meant that there was no longer any reason why being a certain type could hinder a Pokemon based on their specific stat spread. For casual players who just like to play the games for the story, adventure, and love of Pokemon, the physical and special split meant that players no longer had to feel like they should have been using other Pokemon instead of their favorites because they wouldn't be as viable. The split makes leveling up and getting certain moves so much more satisfying when they know exactly how the move will work and how it'll suit their Pokemon and team. For the competitive crowd, it meant that there was now significantly more variety in the Pokemon that would be found on the battlefield, which makes team building way more interesting while also adding a lot of strategic depth to the scene. This also helped the specific competitive roles of mixed attackers and Pokemon that specialize in type coverage. Pokemon who fall into these archetypes generally have deep move pools, and because of the physical and special split, it's now a lot easier for them to find moves that work off the better stat. The physical and special split was a massive gameplay change for one of Nintendo's most popular franchises, and it came at a point when the series wasn't even in any trouble. Nintendo and Game Freak should be credited for looking in the mirror and realizing that one of their core battle mechanics could be significantly improved and seizing the opportunity to do it while Pokemon was still riding high. In every generation and new game since then, many more Pokemon have become viable, which gives players a lot more choice casually and competitively, and it's an awesome example of how a developer proactively changing their game for the better creates a more rewarding experience for players.